Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of our series at the Federal Newswire, our Lunch Hour in Focus on the REINS Act, or the REINS Act in Focus. I'm Andrew Langer, your host. Joining me right now is Margaret Byfield. She is the Executive Director of American Stewards of Liberty, a Western-based organization. And Margaret, let's just jump right into it. Obviously, the REINS Act has huge implications for those interested in public lands and property rights issues, but also the balance of power between the executive branch and the legislative and judicial branch. Talk to us about your perspective on the REINS Act.
Yeah, I think the REINS Act is just pure common sense. I mean, Congress passes laws and oftentimes doesn't specify to the level that they should. But what we end up with is a set of regulations that come from the agencies where they write how this is all going to be implemented. And it ends up looking like something that Congress did not intend. And so there's a couple acts like the Endangered Species Act.
Right.
A lot of people will defend that act and say the actual act is not bad. It's how it's been implemented, and it's all the regulations that the agencies developed. And I think there's some wisdom in that. Another really good piece of legislation to look at is the National Environmental Policy Act.
Sure.
Now, this is one that years ago, as you know, my background, grew up on a ranch in Nevada. Right. And, coming up in the environment that I did, where we filed the first federal lands grazing takings case against the Forest Service and the BLM, I just had this visceral opposition to NEPA because from my viewpoint, it just stopped everything productive. And then I had an attorney ask me, have you ever read the statute? And this is when I was pretty young, and I hadn't. So I sat down and read it. And when I read the statute and compared that to how it was being implemented, It was night and day. I mean, NEPA talks about the need for protecting productive use on these lands and the benefit of that. And that was always something that was supposed to be considered in these analyses. It was not intended to be an environmental document to shut down production. So if you look at the actual act, which at that time it was only 4 pages, and it was pretty simple and clear and straightforward, and then you compare it to the CEQ regulations that were written just shortly thereafter to implement it, and they didn't really even recognize each other. And so, that's where I think a really good example where people could take, if we had something like the REINS Act, that would just put Congress back in the seat of saying, okay, when a regulation is going to cost the economy this much money, we should have the ability to step in and make sure that's what we intended.
Right.
And so it's just part of the checks and balances, and I think it's just common sense.
Right. When you talk about this, I was going to talk about the stormwater management thing. I'll come back to that in a second. But when we talk about the back and forth over the last few years over the definition of waters of the United States, or navigable waters of the United States, many times we've had members of Congress come in and say, this is, we passed the Clean Water Act in 1972. We meant X, yet it's been implemented as Y. This gets Congress to have that say almost immediately afterwards, not almost immediately, but when the regulations are being proposed and moving it down to implementation, the members of Congress who may have voted on these things, they can turn around and say, something, this is not what I had in mind. I didn't mean every ditch that might have a particular kind of grass growing in it for 2 weeks in a year. I didn't mean for it to apply to everything. That's what we're talking about, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And I think we can see that in another good example that took place during the Biden era that really applies to the Western lands is the BLM conservation rule. So they write a brand new rule that basically elevates conservation as a multiple use and prioritizes it over the multiple uses that Congress defined and protected. I mean, Congress set up the federal lands that are managed by the BLM to be used for grazing, mining, timber, oil and gas, recreation, all of those things at once at the same time. And the job of the agency was to make sure those were managed well so all those things could continue on the land. But what the Biden administration did during the BLM or during the Biden administration, the BLM rule turned into something that said, no, now we're going to create conservation leases and only allow these lands to be leased for conservation purposes, getting rid of all those other multiple uses. Congress didn't say that.
So there's so many different ways to sort of look at this, but essentially they're saying, in the same way the EPA tried to redefine the Clean Water Act to say that farm furrows, which had been explicitly set aside as a reasonable use of property, to declare those to be mini mountain ranges. So we redefine that term so that a mountain range all of a sudden is something that's 8 inches tall on a farm. We're going to now say that not using a particular piece of land is in fact a way of using a particular piece of land. I had forgotten about that. It is almost Orwellian in its deviancy is not the right word for it, but its subversiveness, I guess, is the way I want to look at it. Completely redefining the language. Again, Congress has a vested interest in making sure that happens or that doesn't happen, right?
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And the other thing, when these rules go back through our democratic process, which is by that they're going to be viewed by the people who we voted in to make sure that's what we wanted, as opposed to a bureaucrat sitting in an office who is accountable to nobody.
Right.
That's the difference. That gives we the people some control over what the agencies are actually doing. If Congress has that ability to step back in and reevaluate what the agencies are doing to make sure they're implemented correctly.
And it goes the other way too, doesn't it? For folks who are concerned about abuse of power when their particular party is out of power in the executive branch, this helps to protect them as well, so that something doesn't go off and is unhinged. Talk a little bit about that as sort of turning it on its head and underscoring why the Constitution is a brilliant document, because it does this. Talk about that.
Yeah, it gets back to the separation of powers.
Right.
We have to remember that the administrative agencies, they're only charged with one of those three powers, which is to implement the law that Congress writes. But what they have done is by being able to write their own regulations and basically write what they wish Congress would have said through the regulations,
right, sure,
they become lawmakers.
Yes.
They're now writing the laws. And so, like in the situation of the federal land management agencies, both the Forest Service and the BLM, they also have their own administrative judicial tribunal inside. So, for example, in our case, they claimed that we were violating the grazing regulations. So we could only appeal to the Forest Service administrative judge, law judge. So that's where we spent, in our case, we had 3 administrative appeals over a 13-year period. We won them all. But what happens is when you appeal inside the administrative agencies, you can get all the way to the top, which can cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars in our case, and 2 or 3 years of not being able to utilize the land. And you get to the top, to the chief of the Forest Service, and he says, "Oh, geez, I think we were wrong on this. Sorry." And so they give you your permit back, and then they start the same thing over again.
Right.
So it's really a system where they have created where they have all 3 powers. They have the power to implement, to legislate, and to judge.
Wow.
And that's something that really Congress really needs to take a hard look at. And the REINS Act is one really good first step in making that correction, at least taking the lawmaking authority out of the hands of the agencies for at least this limited amount. If it goes over these.
I got to tell you, so on this issue of bias, inherent bias in the administrative process that way, we've made some recommendations. I've made some recommendations to the SBA and their Office of the National Ombudsman on that score to get them to be more of a watchdog in that regard. So we'll come back to that. Well, the other thing I like about this is that there are instances in which the interpretation by these agencies of regulations, they come into conflict with each other, and it's the regulated entities that get caught crosswise. So, for instance, the EPA was out there regulating about dust and particulate matter in areas, and so they passed this rule declaring that businesses had to pave over their surfaces, like if they had lots of dirt parking lots, et cetera. And then a couple of years later, another part of EPA comes back and says, well, we're now going to tax you on your impervious surface area under the Stormwater Management Act. The REINS Act would help sort of deal with and help square this compass, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it would. It would. It would give that chance to take a look at that at a deeper level, more objectively, I think. Yes, it definitely would.
Thank you for that. So listen, Margaret, how do folks find out more about the good work you guys are doing at American Stewards for Liberty?
Well, we're on the website, of course, at americanstewards.us, and we're on social media as well, X and Instagram. So you can check us out there as well and follow us there. But our website is where you can get a lot of the information on what we do.
100%. All kinds of stuff having to do with property rights, public lands, natural resources. But now, of course, deep and abiding constitutional issues like the REINS Act and how that implicates separation of powers. Margaret Byfield, thank you so very much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
This has been yet another episode of our special series on the REINS Act in focus from the Federal Newswire's Lunch Hour podcast. My guest has been Margaret Byfield, the executive director of American Stewards for Liberty. I'm Andrew Langer. Enjoy the rest of your lunch.